In this second lecture on children in the courtroom, I want to share with you some research that was done by my former mentor at Cornell University, Dr. Stephen Ceci. He did a lot of the studies in the 1980s that had to do with children in the courtroom, looking at some of the problems with the way that children were interviewed. Before we start talking about the studies and the issues that surrounded the interviewing of kids, I hope that you'll watch the two videos on the McMartin case and the Fells Acre case first before you watch this video or you listen to this video, because I think it will give you a really good idea of what some of the problems were with regard to how the children were being interviewed. So why don't you watch those videos first and then come listen to this lecture next, because this lecture I will be describing some research that showed some of the problems that you get when you try to interview children incorrectly. So let's take a look at what some of the problems were that were highlighted in the videos, the McMartin and the Fells Acre case. First of all, there were lots of leading and misleading questions. The interviewers inserted information into their questions that the children didn't even mention. So for example, they might say something like, was he wearing a cowboy shirt? When the child didn't even say anything about the shirt. So you're insinuating that some kind of Western style shirt. Misleading, obviously, things that were not true. Another thing that they did a lot of was a stereotype induction. So the individuals that were accused of these wrongdoing, they'd say things like, that bad Peggy Bucky, we'll put her away forever and she won't be able to hurt kids anymore if you help us. So stereotype induction. Obviously, one of the other things that happened to the kids that they were questioned repeatedly, and sometimes they didn't say anything about abuse during in the first interview or the second interview, but by the 10th interview, they're starting to make some allegations. And obviously, one of the last things is interviewer bias. Many of the interviewers in these cases were overzealous. We talked about this a little bit last time. So they believed, I'm sure they weren't trying to do anything bad, they weren't trying to hurt anyone, but they believed that abuse had happened, and they went in to the interviews to try to get the information. So let's take a look at some research that has looked at some of these things here, and whether or not they can create problems in children, errors. Now, what we're going to have to do is, obviously, you can't mimic the real world in the laboratory. You can't put those kids through the kind of questioning that the kids in the McMartin case were put through. But Steve Ceci did a number of studies that showed some really convincingly that some of these things can lead to problems. So let's take a look at the first thing. Leading and misleading questions and stereotype induction. And this set of studies is often referred to as the Sam Stone studies. Most people in the psych and law field know the Sam Stone studies. In fact, that's what we refer to them as, but they're Steve's first set of studies. So let me just tell you what the Sam Stone study was. Okay, this was done in a preschool daycare kind of setting. So you had 3 and 4-year-olds, and you actually had 5 and 6-year-olds, because at that time they had half-day kindergarten, so the kids were in daycare half the day. And so what happened was children were randomly assigned to either a condition where they get leading and misleading questions or not, and either stereotype induction or not. So it's a 2x2 design. So let me tell you what they did. So the stereotype induction was great. So the preschool teacher would come into class one day and she would say to her kids, so if let's say you're in the stereotype induction situation, she'll say, oh kids, I've got to tell you a story. My good friend Sam Stone came to visit me last night, and I made him tea in my favorite teacups. But Sam Stone is so clumsy, he tripped and broke one of my teacups. And the kids, of course, get into the stories. So for a few weeks, the teacher would come in at least once a week and tell another Sam Stone story. It got to the point where kids would, the teacher would say, guess what, kids? And they'd say, what? And my friend Sam Stone came last night. And the kids would go, oh no, what did he break this time? So what we're doing is we're inducing a stereotype that Sam Stone is klutzy and breaks things. Okay, then on the day, the big day arrives, Sam Stone comes into the daycare and interacts with some of the children. And so the children interact with Sam Stone. Nothing happens at the daycare. Sam Stone doesn't do anything at all in the daycare. So Sam Stone visits and then he leaves. And about an hour or so after Sam Stone leaves, the teacher picks up a book and notices that a page has been torn out of the book. So somebody ripped a page, and that's when the children were interviewed. Okay, so half of the kids had had the induction, stereotype induction, and half the kids had not. And now they're randomly assigned to either get neutral questions or misleading questions. And so obviously they're questioned things like, do you think that Sam Stone might have torn the page? Did you see Sam Stone with the book? Those kinds of things. And then 1 week later, they were questioned again. So the results that I'm going to show you now are 1 week later. We've done all this preparation. First, I want to show you what happens in the control group. These are the kids that got no stereotype and no suggestions. And they were asked to report what happened the day that Sam Stone came there. So I'm going to orient you to this chart because you're going to be seeing it over and over again. On this axis is the percent errors, the percentage of errors that the children made. Okay, this white or cream bar is the percentage that made 1 or 2 errors. So they said things that actually did not happen. Then if they made an error, the interviewer pushed them a little bit and said, did you see it happen? Okay, did you witness it? And then if they said, yeah, I saw it. And then that was the next push saying, are you sure you saw that? Okay, so what you're doing is you're kind of pushing the kids to backtrack on what they've just said. So what do we see here? First of all, I think it's really clear that the 3 and 4-year-olds are a bit of a problem here. They make more errors than the 5 and 6-year-olds. Obviously, the 5 and 6-year-olds made a couple errors, but most of the time they backed down if they were pushed a bit. But the 3 and 4-year-olds did make a few errors. But overall, what I would say is the kids did a pretty good job telling you what happened when Sam Stone came, when they had not been pushed by a stereotype or suggestive questioning the week before. But now let's take a look at some of these other conditions. This is the condition where you just got the stereotype, but you didn't get the suggestive questioning. So they got the stereotype that Sam Stone was a klutz. And here are the results of that condition. You see the 3 and 4-year-olds, almost 40% of the kids are starting to make errors that include Sam Stone having torn a page in the book. By the way, the children, it wasn't just the torn page. Kids were alleging at some point that Sam Stone got chocolate on a teddy bear, that he was throwing dolls in the air and one broke. So it's not limited to that one page that was broken. So you see again the 3 and 4-year-olds having a problem here. And many more of the kids, about 10%, maintaining even when they're pushed. Now what you're seeing here also is the 5 and 6-year-olds are starting to bite, and they're starting to take the stereotype and incorporate some of that stereotype into their memory. Here's the group that had no stereotype, but just the suggestive questioning. Look at this, okay? The suggestive questioning is a real problem. You see that over 50% of the 3 and 4-year-olds and almost 40% of the 5 and 6-year-olds are incorporating some of the suggestions from the questions into their own recollections of what happened. And what you can see here, again, what's happening is you're getting many more children saying, yes, they saw Sam Stone do this, which in fact is false. Okay? And you're seeing more kids push back and say, no, I saw this. And then finally, this is the group with the double whammy. They got both the stereotype and the suggestions, which is what a lot of the McMartin kids got. And here are the results there. And they're pretty astounding. You see that 75% of the 3 and 4-year-olds make errors that incorporate both the stereotype and the suggestion. And you've got over 20% of the 3 and 4-year-olds saying not only that they witnessed it, but then maintaining it even after being pushed. And again, the 5 and 6-year-olds were less of a problem, but look at the high numbers here. If you're trying to do a forensic interview where you're trying to get the truth for a case, where you're actually going to charge people, these numbers are pretty astounding. And I just want to remind you that these were the numbers for the control group. So the children in this study showed that when adults use stereotypes or suggestive questioning, you can get kids to change their stories. Okay? And I don't have a video. I'm not going to show you the video of these little children's stories, but they're pretty convincing. When you watch the little kids talking on the video, it doesn't look like they're lying. It looks like they actually believe what they're telling the interviewer. Okay, so stereotype and suggestive questioning. The next type of problem that Steve Ceci addressed was repeated questioning. And this was the mousetrap study, the Steve Ceci's mousetrap study. Now, I want to show you a little clip of the mousetrap study, and it's part of a larger video, but I'm going to find the place where it starts, okay? So this is the mousetrap study.
Unless something really happened. It's a persuasive argument until you hear about Ceci's next experiment. He had researchers ask 4- and 5-year-olds to pick a card out of a deck of 10. On each card was a question.
Okay, Derek. This one says, have you ever seen a baby alligator eating apples on an airplane?
No.
No? Have you ever had your finger caught in a mousetrap and had to go to the hospital?
No.
No? Your class?
At first, almost all the kids say no.
Mm-mm.
But then, once a week for the next 10 weeks, they ask the question again. No coercion, no leading questions as in child abuse cases. They just gently repeat the question.
You went to the hospital because your finger got caught in a mousetrap. Did that happen?
Uh-huh.
Yeah?
By week 4 or 6 or 10, most of the kids are saying, yes, it happened. And not just saying yes, but giving such precise information about it that you'd think it must have happened.
Did it hurt?
Yeah.
Yeah? Who took you to the hospital?
My daddy, my mommy, my brother.
So where in your house is the mousetrap?
It's up at our, down in the basement.
Down in the basement. What is it next to in the basement?
It's next to the firewood.
Anyway, what you see here is a child who's giving you a lot of perceptual detail. He's telling you where the mousetrap was. It was next to a wood pile in the basement. He had gone down there because he wanted to tell his dad, who was down there collecting firewood, that he was ready for lunch. He gets in an argument with his brother Colin, which he later goes on to describe. They were fighting over some action figure. Colin pushes him next to the wood pile. He doesn't see where his hand's going, and he gets caught in the mousetrap.
Were you surprised at the answers you got?
I think it's fair to say that my colleagues and I were absolutely shocked that by the 10th week, not only were they assenting to some of these things that didn't occur, but they were giving very coherent narratives, highly elaborated narratives that are, I think, quite persuadable.
By the time I met the same boy, it was weeks after the experiment, but he still could give lots of convincing details about things that never happened.
Was there a time when you got your finger caught in a mousetrap and had to go to the hospital? Wow, which finger was it?
Remember, this is the result after a researcher simply asked the question once a week for 10 weeks. In real abuse cases, kids are questioned for years, often by parents, doctors, then by the investigator, perhaps a therapist, then by lawyers.
Who went with you to the hospital?
My mom and my dad and my brother Colin, but not my baby. He was in my mom's tummy.
Your baby.
This boy's testimony is even more remarkable because just a few days earlier, his father had discussed the experiment with him. He'd explained that it was just a test and the whole mousetrap event had never happened. The boy agreed it was just in his imagination. Still, listen to this.
Let me ask you, did your father tell you something about the mousetrap finger story?
No,
Is it true? Did it really happen?
A story. It really happened.
It's really happened? You really got your finger caught? It's really happened?
Yeah.
I think you can see by that little video clip, the little boy is pretty convincing. And he not only has a narrative, a very elaborate narrative, but he has time in his narrative too, because if you noticed, the baby was in his mommy's tummy, so he's placing it in his autobiographical timeline too. So it's pretty amazing. And this was for something that never even happened. I just want to mention that one of the interesting things about the CC mousetrap study that doesn't get mentioned very much is you saw that some of the questions were nonsensical. Did you ever see an alligator eating apples in an airplane? It turns out that those kinds of nonsensical questions children don't bite on, but they will bite on. They will start to believe stories or questions when they seem like it could have happened. And so it's not that children, if they're just repeatedly questioned about silly things, they're going to start to put it in their memories. But in fact, when it's sort of the kinds of things that could have happened, they're more likely to do that. So there, in this particular study, it showed the danger of repeated questioning. Finally, I want to share with you the last study that Steve did, and this was the Simon Says study. Basically, what they did was the children in the daycare played Simon Says, and the graduate student who went down and played Simon Says with them did some things with them that were part of the game. So, for example, Simon Says to pretend like you're licking ice cream, and the children would lick ice cream. Okay. Simon Says to walk over to the person next to you and touch their elbow. Simon Says, and you get the hang of it, right? Well, so what happened was there were some specific things that the kids did in the Simon Says game, and there were some things that they didn't do. Okay, so this was summertime at Cornell, and there were a bunch of seasoned Department of Family Service workers who were attending a conference and attending a workshop at Cornell, and they were going to be part of this study. So you have seasoned social workers. So they come in and they told, okay, so let me just explain to you. They were divided randomly into 3 groups. In one group, the informed group, they were told what the children played when they played Simon Says, and they were told the truth. Okay? The misinformed group was told that the children played Simon Says, and here are the things that the children did, and they were told misinformation. So they were told things that the kids didn't do. And then finally, there was a group of interviewers that were told nothing about, just that the children played Simon Says, and that you were to try to get the child to talk about what happened. So those social workers then made notes of their interviews. And by the way, this is a way it often was happening at that time. You know, people took notes while they're interviewing a child, but then later on, somebody else might have to interview a child, and they often used the notes from the first interviewer to interview a child. So what you have here is sort of a real world reenactment of what happens in the real world. So you have the first set of interviewers. They're either informed, misinformed, or neutral. And the second set of interviewers are blind to what was happening before. All they did was they were given the notes and told to interview the child. Okay? So what did they find? Well, I think the results are very interesting. This is the second interview, okay? And here are the results. First of all, I want you to notice, again, so the neutral is the orange bars. And these are the percentage of errors. What you see is when the neutral interviewers interview kids, they don't know what happened. And so they could ask some leading questions unbeknownst to them. And there are some errors that you see. However, the informed interviewers, the interviewers that were told the truth about what actually happened, got those kids to actually talk about things that actually happened in the interview. And so those kids made very few errors. However, the misinformed interviewers drug a lot of misinformation out of those children's mouths. So they read the notes of another interviewer that said that the children had to hop on one foot. And so they asked a lot of questions about hopping on one foot and got those children to assent and say, yeah, we hopped on one foot. And so those children made many more errors. Now, the interesting thing I think about this study is not just that it shows the problem with interviewer bias, but in the real world. Think about yourself in the real world. If there's an allegation of sexual abuse, which condition are you in? The reality is you don't know, okay? And if somebody tells you some details about what happened to a child, but those details are incorrect, you are now a misinformed interviewer. On the other hand, if you're lucky enough to only get correct details, you're an informed interviewer. And in fact, the fact of the matter is, in the real world, you never know which one of those interviews you are. And based on where you are on there, it might lead you to ask incorrect questions of the children and get errors. Okay? So this is a series of studies that I wanted to share with you just to show you what we were finding in the 80s and 90s about some of these daycare cases and the questioning and the techniques that were used. So through the early 90s, there's a lot of studies coming out and basically showing that even in a lab, you could get children to assent to some of these things. So one of the things, and I didn't cover this today, but some of the studies, some of the interviewers exposed kids to books about secrets, talking about sexual abuse. Little Johnny Rabbit was hurt by his uncle, but he's told not to tell. And they read this little story about Johnny Rabbit, who then finally tells and feels a lot better. So whether or not these books are suggestive, and in fact they are, okay? Exposing children to negative stereotypes about people, the stereotype induction. Another thing is using a lot of yes and no kinds of questions. Instead of asking kids to tell their story, having questions: did he wear this? Did she do that? Those kinds of things, which can be very leading. Another thing that you saw quite often is ignoring children's initial no answers. So the repeated questioning. Did so-and-so hurt you? No. And then asking it again. Did he hurt you? And obviously embedding new information into your questions, using misinformation, information that the child did not tell you. How do we lessen the chances of false memories? Obviously, conduct interviews using one of the validated protocols. Since the early 90s, what happened was the researchers showed very clearly that these interviews were a problem. And once that was pretty clear, then the question is, how can we make the interviews better? And there are quite a few interviews out there now that have been validated, and I'm going to share one with you in a few seconds. But if you're doing a forensic interview with a child, you should be using one of those validated protocols. Secondly, minimize the number of interviews. Children should not be repeatedly interviewed. And then importantly is record that first interview. That forensic interview, the one that you do that uses a validated protocol, that must be recorded, because that interview then stands as the official record of what the child says. Okay, so let me share with you before we end one protocol. This is not the only one, but it's a forensic interview. It's the NICHD protocol. It's the National Institute of Child Health and Development protocol. It was developed and has been validated. And the way I think of these protocols is that they're kind of inverted funnels. Let me explain. So let's just go through this. First of all, you introduce yourself and talk to the child about what's going to happen. You do a truth-lie ceremony. We're going to talk about this a little bit more, but you're basically getting the child to promise to tell the truth. Then the third step, you're doing some rapport building and language sampling. What does the children call certain things, certain parts of their body? Who's Nana? Children have unique names. And you're also just building some kind of rapport. So the fourth piece is really important because it's sort of a practice interview. So what you're going to try to do is get the child to practice. So before you start talking about sexual abuse allegations, what you might do is a little mini interview about some recent event. So what you might say is, "Oh, Johnny, I noticed here that 2 months ago you had a birthday. Is that right?" And the child says yes. "Listen, why don't you tell me what happened on your birthday? What I want you to do is start from the moment you woke up and tell me everything that happened that day." So what you're doing is you're trying to get a narrative account of the child's birthday, which is neutral. And then you might do sort of a mini interview follow up with some cue questions. So get a narrative account of the birthday, ask some cued questions, ask some open direct questions, and so forth and so on. Get what I'm saying? And then you start to talk about the allegations. Now, this NICHD protocol is very long. When you have multiple allegations, you start with the last incident. Okay, if the child reports, you follow up with some cue questions. Some children are notoriously famous for leaving out details that are really important to you. Okay, as a forensic interviewer, these are details that you need for the case. And then you might have to ask a paired open direct question. Now, remember I said it was a funnel? That's because there should be fewer and fewer as you go down here. Most of the information should come from here. A little bit less and less. And then you might have to go to the first incident. Okay, finally. You see you doing this over and over and over again. Finally, at the end, if necessary, you might have to ask a leading question. It's not, completely taboo to ask a leading question, especially if the child has left out some information that is forensically crucial to your case. You've gotten all these stories, and let's say the child has not mentioned the person by name. Okay, so you might have to get some more information, and you might have to say something. Okay, at the end, you invite the child to talk about anything else they want to, and then return to a neutral topic and end the interview. So this protocol is not the only one that people use across the country, but it's one of many that have been validated, and it avoids using the kind of questioning that we see that caused so many problems in the 1980s. Okay, next time in our last child lecture, I'm going to talk about some courtroom protocols that have been tried to help children testify in the court. Okay, thank you.